Alright, welcome back everybody. I've got a very different type of video today. I decided I would go back into some of my oldest D&D books and find some of the original comments made by Gary Gygax, which probably any of you out there know was one of, if not the primary creator of the game. So I went back into some of my old books and just scanned them so you could see which ones I was looking at. Just scanned the cover and then just looked to the inside to look at the words Gary gave at the very beginning. So if we look at this right here, this is, I believe, my oldest book, goes back to 1974. Somebody actually gave it to me and it was in rough condition when I got it, but you can see what one of the very original books actually looked like right there. And if we take a look to the inside right here, well, we've got just a little brief page. He got just a little bit more lengthy as he went further along in other books, but was pretty short in this one. So it tells you this right here is based on the original work published back in 1974. You may have seen before there were these three original little tiny little booklets that really started D&D. So this kind of put them together right here. And he goes through to tell you this just gives the basics of the gameplay right here. If you want to know how to play D&D, here's your basic rules. This is a great place to start right here. Something funny about this, and I have a video on this book. If you want to see every page of this book and how it was all originally written, you can go back at and check that out on my channel right there. But it was real funny how these original rules only allow for players to advance up to level 3 right there. So when I tell you it was basic, there in the beginning, there was so little to it. It was really funny. So go back and check that video out if you want to see more about how it all started. So he goes on to tell you right here, the game is completely open-ended. It's subject to modification, expansion, and interpretation according to the desires of the group participating, and is generally not bound by the conventional limitations of other types of games. I think this is one of the most important comments that Gary Gygax ever made in all of his books right here. With so many games, you got these set of rules, and you'll see people pull this set of instructions out and say, well, this is how it works, and so on down the line. I believe what Gary was saying right here is like, look, use this as a framework. Here are your guidelines, and then modify this any way you see fit to make it most enjoyable to you and your group. And I think that's one of the things some people don't ever really get is, there's not just one set of rules. I don't care what game you play at anybody's house. It seems like every house has slightly different variations. And I think D&D goes with that more than any other game that's ever been invented. So don't get caught up, in just one particular set of rules. If your group finds that modifying something here and there makes it more enjoyable, that is the number one thing. It's not about following the rules. It's about making it enjoyable and fun for everyone to play. People aren't enjoying it, they're not going to play it for very long. So notice down here you got a list of contributors, and this is one of the few places where I just see his name is Ernie Gygax. Usually it's E. Gary Gygax just about everywhere he signs, but back in the very early days right there, that was what we saw. So that goes with just some of the original rules right there, and this is inside of the same book. So here's a foreword. Notice it's got E. Gary Gygax typed up right down here. And I like the way he starts this off, right? Here's a foreword for the original editions. Here's how it all started. And I like the way he begins this. Once upon a time, long, long ago. Do you remember the beginning credits to Star Wars? It said, once upon a time in a galaxy far, far away. That was immediately what I thought of when I read this first line right up here. Maybe that's coincidence. This actually was written before the original Star Wars. Maybe somebody got that from him. Maybe just coincidence altogether. But he goes on to say here, all war gamers who are interested in the medieval period, and that's primarily what D&D revolves around in most all campaigns, is that sort of time frame right there, will enjoy playing Dungeons and Dragons. So he sort of introduces them to a time frame and talks about beginning a campaign. In other words, it's not like most games like Monopoly where you start and end one, usually with one session. It can be ongoing forever, never ending. He mentions just about the only thing that you'll need to play this game in addition to what you have right here is pencil and paper. In other words, this is not going to be costly. At least sure didn't start off that way, right? The most extensive requirement is time, and he's definitely right there. If you got time, imagination, pencil, and paper, that's pretty much what you need to play Dungeons and Dragons right there. So he goes on to tell you here these rules are strictly fantasy. Those wargamers who lack imagination will not be likely to find Dungeons and Dragons to their taste. Again, imagination's the #1 thing for this game. But those whose imaginations know no bounds will find that these rules are the answer to their prayers. You gotta like that. With this last bit of advice, we invite you to read on and enjoy a world where the fantastic is fact and magic really works. And there you got Gary Gygax, November 1, 1973. That's the earliest reference I can find in any of the books that I have mentioning anything about the game right there. So I like the way he talks about, hey, you've got just the basics, pencil, paper, and just a little bit of time and so on, and you've got imagination, this is the game for you. If you don't have imagination, you might want to move on to something else. So notice even back here as far as November 73, the artwork was still great. Looks like we've got a lizard on a lizard's helmet riding another lizard. Looks sort of like an iguana. So there again, those first 3 pages all go back to original rules. Now here's the Advanced D&D Player's Handbook right here. I think this is probably the most iconic picture in all of D&D from the very beginning up till today. So look at this. Looks like these adventurers have killed some type of lizard-like creatures in the evil temple, and they're prying out these eyes, look like giant rubies or whatever right here. I think that says D&D right there. Looks like you've got some type of wizard over here, maybe a couple of fighter types, and looks like a cleric and so on. So that is iconic D&D through and through. So if we look down here at the bottom, we see the whole of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons was a project which involved varying degrees of my thought, imagination, you see that word mentioned again, and actual working time over a period of more than 1.5 years. So I guess that's how long he spent on this book right here. Now here's something that's interesting. He references the Monster Manual was selected as the first of the 3 volumes in the advanced game to work on. I wondered for the longest time why my Monster Manual had an earlier print date than what the Player's Handbook in the DM's Guide did. Well, I guess that explains it right there. Gary wanted the Monster Manual out first. Looks like he finished it initially. Hundreds of different creatures lend themselves to segmental treatment. Only after that book was finished, the Monster Manual, did I begin to put the sheathed reams of notes for the players in Dungeon Master's books into order. Isn't that interesting? He wanted the Monster Manual first. So down here at the bottom, the game's major appeal is to those persons with unusually active imagination, there you see it again, and superior active intellect. So he considers these smart folks right here. I guess how D&D got to be sort of known as the nerd's game right there. And he says they're a very demanding audience. So I thought that was a really interesting introduction there. So he goes on here on the second page. No individual can actually dictate the actual operations of a campaign. However, for that is the prerogative of the Dungeon Master first and foremost, and to the players in the individual campaign thereafter. I like that. Nobody dictates to you how your campaign is going to be ran. You're going to do it differently than probably every other DM on the planet. Make it your own, whatever you enjoy. You will find material which enables the Dungeon Master to conduct a campaign which is challenging, where the unexpected is the order of the day. Very well said. I see here one of the very first mentions of sonics in the game. A lot of people don't use that, but notice it was mentioned way back here. So he goes on to say, even though the most important material herein can be altered and bent to suit the needs of individual campaigns. So again, make it your own. Persons who contributed to the original game, and he gives a big long list right here. Notice we see some of the Gygaxes listed, like Ernie Gygax. I believe that was his oldest son right there. And there's his signature. Again, Gary Gygax is how he signed most all this stuff. Then we move on to the Dungeon Master's Guide right here. So there's that original cover, and this was actually how they imagined an Ifrit at that time. And on the back of the DM's guide was the City of Brass and a lot more. So again, a very iconic group looks like right here. Looks like some type of wizard, some type of fighter, and not sure what she would have been right there. So there's what you saw in the original Advanced DM's Guide. So looking on at this one here, notice he tells up here at the top, this is written from one dungeon master to another, right there, all being equal. When you build your campaign, you will tailor it to suit your personal taste. We see that over and over. You as referee will have to devote countless hours of real effort in order to produce just a fledgling campaign, a background. Maybe it's just something like the beginning of a small village or town where everything starts. You have to develop dungeon levels and so much more. It's going to be a lot of work for the DM. If it is all too plain and too easy, the players will quickly lose interest. So notice he's giving some advice right here. And your effort will prove to have been all in vain. Likewise, if the campaign is too difficult, players will quickly become discouraged and lose interest in a game where they're always the butt. And I agree with that right there. Over the 40 plus years I've been playing this game, the number one problem I've seen more than anything else are DMs who cannot leave their ego at the door. They see this as them, the DM, versus the players. That's not how it's supposed to be. Draw up something which is challenging, but not just highly difficult, maybe just for most of the experienced players. Again, if the players see that it's just a DM versus them and the DM makes all the rules, they'll quickly know it's nothing but a losing game, and they're going to lose interest in it quick. So they tell you here, as a participant in the game, I would not care to have anyone telling me exactly what must go into a campaign and how it must be handled. If so, why not just play chess? Gary, you said it perfectly right there. So he goes on, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, what is aimed at is a universe into which similar campaigns and parallel worlds can be placed. With certain uniformity, players will be able to move from one campaign to another and know at least the principles. In other words, nobody plays exactly the same, but make it all similar enough that players can jump from one DM's campaign to another and they know exactly what to expect. So he mentions this uniformity right here. It might also eventually lead to grand tournaments where persons from any part of the U.S. or the world, for that matter, can compete. So Gary saw this coming way down the road right here. And of course, they have these big conventions to this date. Participants will always be pushing for a game which allows them to become strong, and powerful far too quickly. Each will attempt to take the game out of your hands and mold it to suit their ends. To satisfy this natural desire is to issue a death warrant to a campaign. Looks like he was saying right here, do not let the players take over and bully the DM. Play it as you see best. Don't let them advance too quickly. As this book is the exclusive precinct of the DM, you must view any non-DM player possessing it as something less than worthy of an honorable death. No peeping players. I like that right there. So he has a little section on credits and acknowledgements here. Talks about the persons who contributed. There's Ernie. Again, I think that was his oldest son, and Luke was another. And you see lots of other people. It's probably the original people he played with here. He also thanks the artist. Dungeons and Dragons is known for its art as much as anything, if not more, right there. So look at this. Mentions a couple of people, Dave Sutherland, and Dave looks like Tramp here, right there. And goes on to say, if I neglected anyone, please forgive me. This has taken him 2 years. He's read hundreds of pages, something he began back in '76. And there again, you see it signed E. Gary Gygax once again. That seems to be what he seemed to stick with as far as his signature in other books. So again, I thought it was always odd. Why did I see an earlier print date on the Monster Manual? As we saw, Gary finished that one first. Again, you would think it would be Player's Handbook, then DM's Guide, and then something like the Monster Manual next, but evidently that's how it went. So he's got a short little introduction right here. So he wants to, again, to acknowledge contributions. He mentions a Steve Marsh. Looks like he concentrated more on undersea encounters and creatures. Errol Otis. Looks like the Ankh-Egg and the Remoras were more of his work. Ernie Gygax, again, I believe that's his eldest son for the Water Weird. Terry Kuntz, who was never thanked for the prototypical beholder. Is Gary telling us that this fellow right here is the original imagination behind the beholder, which is one of, if not the most iconic monster in Dungeons and Dragons right there. So he goes on to thank the whole crew at TSR. Again, that was original company and such right there. Thanks his wife Mary, who evidently did most all the typing, and says, if I've missed anyone, please pardon it. And there it is, Gary Gygax, once again on the inside of the Monster Manual. And then here's one of the books a lot of people didn't get back at the time, the Deities and Demigods. And again, this was no than one of those supplements that Gary evidently felt was really important. Now look right here in this foreword. He talks about how there's a general neglect of deities in Dungeons and Dragons. Game masters tended to ignore them, and he warns against this. So he talks about these individuals, James Ward and Rob Kuntz. I believe they were mentioned before right there for their work. He mentions how they adhered to the concepts which were instrumental in making Advanced Dungeons and Dragons what it is. Deities and Demigods, look at this, is an indispensable part of the whole of AD&D. Do not fall into the error of regarding it as a supplement. It is integral to dungeon masters in a true AD&D campaign. Those readers not well grounded in ongoing campaigns must take my word for all of this, although they will soon discover for themselves how crucial the deities of the campaign are. So, of course, he talks about how the book is separated into pantheons, like is it under Greek mythology or, one of the others that's very popular, things we see of in movies and things such as that. So he tells the DM you may want to select a pantheon that best suits your campaign. In other words, does it have sort of a traditional Greek background to where your setting and campaign is at? Is it more of things you'd seen in ancient Egypt or anything such as that? He goes on to mention diabolical and demonic deities are important to the campaign. Why are the evil ones important? Without evil, what does good have to strive against? Good point right there, Gary. Characters who become a match for these deities and demigods are obviously to be ranked amongst their number. No longer suitable for daily campaign interaction. They need to be removed to another place and plane and treated accordingly. So if players ever get something to actually challenge these deities and demigods, he says take them out. So again, he stresses this needs to be a big part and says up here at the top, this shouldn't be regarded as just a supplement right there. So he really stresses this. And there again you see Gary Gygax. That was May 1 of 1980 right there. So that's some of Gary's very early words that you have right here. And again, I don't know if it'll would actually let me put up all the dates or whatever right there. But if I go back through them once again to the beginning, we see up here at the top 74 for the original rules, and then 1978 for the Advanced Player's Handbook, 79 for the Dungeon Master's Guide, and then notice how we jump back to 77 for the Monster Manual. Purchased all these books when I was just a little old kid. And then 1980 for the Deities and Demigods right there, and that was the end. So I hope you enjoyed looking at some of these original books and the words by Gary Gygax. Maybe that'll give you an impression of what Gary had for the game in the future. Looks like he even foresaw the large conventions where hopefully people would come from all over the world. So I've got actually a whole lot of other books after these right here where Gary's probably put some words in those too. If you want more information on all this, just let me know. Until then, good luck and good gaming.